My name is Hannah Wells. I'm 25 years old, and I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And this is the story of how my silence became my greatest weapon. They say families are supposed to care, check in on you, love you unconditionally. But what happens when they don't? What happens when your own family treats you like a ghost, until they find out you're the one holding the deed to everything they thought they'd inherit? That's exactly what happened to me. I became invisible to the people who should have known me best, until I made a decision that shook the very foundation of who they thought I was. That's when they remembered I existed. But by then, it was too late. I grew up in a family that loved appearances more than affection. On the outside, we looked like the perfect portrait. The Wells family, church on Sundays, backyard barbecues, polite smiles. But under that surface was a kind of coldness I didn't know how to name as a child. I only knew I felt it. Especially when I spoke and no one seemed to hear me. Especially when I cried and no one asked why. Especially when I disappeared into myself and no one noticed. Before I continue with this story, pause for a second and tell me in the comments, what's your name and where are you watching from? I want to know who's listening, because this story isn't just mine. It's for every woman who's ever felt like her pain was invisible, like her voice didn't matter. I need to tell it, because I know someone out there is still waiting for the courage to speak. Maybe my story will help you find your own. And if you feel that, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. My father, Richard Wells, was the kind of man people admired. Stoic, accomplished, respected, but he was never affectionate. He loved control, not connection. My mother, Denise, always smiled at the right moments, always had perfect hair and perfect posture. She kept the house like a museum, immaculate, but cold. She asked about my grades, my clothes, but never my feelings. And my older brothers, Jason and Grant, were stars in their own right. Jason was the golden boy, varsity football captain, always loud, always praised. Grant was quieter, more calculating. He knew how to get what he wanted without making a scene. Me? I was just Hannah, the youngest, the girl, the afterthought. I was never abused, not in the way people understand abuse, but I was dismissed. My voice never seemed to carry weight. When I shared good news, it was overlooked. When I was sad, I was told I was dramatic. When I was sick, I was told to rest and stop complaining. It was as if I had to beg for space in a family that had already decided who mattered and who didn't. There was only one place where I felt like I belonged. The family cabin. Nestled near a quiet lake about 2 hours north of Green Bay, the cabin had been in our family for 3 generations. It had that old, wooden smell of pine and lake water. The walls were filled with photos of summers past, and though I rarely appeared in them, the space felt sacred to me. My grandparents built it with their own hands. I remember sneaking up there by myself one weekend in high school just to sit on the dock and cry. It was the only place I could be fully myself. No masks, no expectations, just peace. Over time, the cabin became a symbol of something deeper. It represented not just my childhood, but also the family legacy. And that legacy was always assumed to belong to my brothers. Dad talked about it like it was theirs already. Mom would say things like, when Jason has kids, they'll have summers here too. I was never mentioned in those plans. Not once. It was like they had already written me out of the script. I moved out at 18, put myself through community college, then transferred to UW-Milwaukee for my degree in psychology. I worked part-time at a bookstore, lived in a tiny apartment with a leaky ceiling, and called home less and less as the years passed. Not because I was bitter, at least not then, but because they never reached out either. Birthdays passed with a casual text. Holidays came and went, often without an invitation. I began to realize that if I didn't show up, no one would notice. But I was watching, and I was remembering. It wasn't until my grandfather passed away that the cabin came back into the conversation. I was 22, fresh out of college, juggling 2 jobs and still finding my footing. At the reading of the will, I showed up alone. My brothers arrived in suits, smirking like they already knew what was written. My parents looked bored, like this was just a formality. But when the lawyer read the clause that changed everything, the air in the room shifted. To my granddaughter, Hannah Wells, I leave full ownership of the family cabin. I know you're the only one who truly loved it." There was silence. Real, dense, unforgettable silence. My father's face twitched, his jaw tightened. My mother blinked fast like she was trying to stay composed. Jason let out a quiet, "What?" and Grant's eyes narrowed in a way that made my skin crawl. But I didn't say a word. I just sat there, my hands folded in my lap, my face unreadable. That moment rewrote everything. Suddenly, I was visible again. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know how I was, what I was thinking, what I planned to do with our cabin. Except it wasn't our cabin anymore. It was mine. At first, they pretended to be supportive. Jason called to check in for the first time in years. Grant sent me articles about renovating lake houses. My mom left long voicemails dripping with faux warmth, offering to help if it ever got overwhelming. But I knew what it was. It wasn't love. It was proximity to power. It was their old habit of pretending, just refined for a new game. I kept my distance. I didn't respond right away. I didn't tell them my plans. I didn't ask for advice. And that made them nervous. Then came the real storm. 2 weeks after the will was executed, I started receiving letters, legal threats, attempts to dispute the will, claims that my grandfather must have been manipulated. My own father called me a liar. Jason accused me of forging something. Grant suggested I step aside for the good of the family. And that's when something inside me changed. I had spent most of my life shrinking myself, hoping someone would make space for me. But now I had something they couldn't take without my permission, something they had ignored until it became valuable. And for the first time, I felt powerful. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I finally saw them for who they really were, and saw myself for who I could become without their shadows hanging over me. I made a decision then, one that would shake everything they thought they knew about the girl they used to overlook. And that's where this story truly begins. I didn't respond to the letters. I didn't show up to the mediation meetings they tried to schedule. I didn't return my father's calls, nor my mother's long, teary voicemails. I let the silence speak for me, something I had learned well from them. Except now, silence wasn't an act of surrender. It was strategy. I had already consulted my own attorney the same day the will was read. She was sharp, direct, and not the least bit afraid of the Wells family name. She told me my grandfather's will was airtight, legally sound, ironclad. There was nothing they could do. And I think that terrified them more than anything else. For once, they couldn't change the rules just because they didn't like the outcome. I drove up to the cabin alone on a cold February morning. The lake was frozen, the trees bare and gray, and the air bit at my skin when I stepped out of the car. Still, I stood there for a long while, just looking at the house. It hadn't changed much. The green shutters were still chipped in the corners. The swing on the porch creaked in the wind. But something about it felt different now, like it was breathing with me, like it knew. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cold hit me instantly, but I didn't mind. I walked slowly through the living room, touching the backs of old chairs, gliding my fingers along the frame of a faded photo on the mantel. My grandfather's face looked out from the picture, eyes kind and a little mischievous. I whispered, "Thank you," under my breath, and for the first time in months, I felt warmth. Renovations weren't necessary, but I chose to make a few changes anyway. Not to erase the past, but to make the place fully mine. I painted the walls soft white, replaced the old curtains with linen ones that let in more light. I moved some furniture around, added a reading nook by the window facing the lake, and installed shelves for all the books I had collected over the years. It became a haven, a space of healing, but I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. That part was important. A month passed. Then 2. That's when my father showed up. It was a Saturday. I had just come back from a walk around the lake when I saw a familiar black SUV parked near the edge of the driveway. He was standing on the porch, hands in the pockets of his coat, his breath visible in the cold. I didn't rush. I took slow steps toward him, keeping my gaze steady. When I reached the stairs, he spoke first. "You didn't answer my calls?" "I know," I said. He looked past me into the cabin. "You did some changes." "I did." He hesitated, the way he always did when he was pretending to be calm. "This place means a lot to the family." I didn't respond, just watched him. He cleared his throat. I think you know it would make more sense if Jason took over. You're young. You've got your own life. I leaned on the railing. Jason has never spent a single night here unless there was a barbecue involved. My father's jaw clenched. That's not the point. I shrugged. It kind of is. We stood in silence. The wind rustled the trees. The swing creaked behind us. He finally looked at me and said, "What do you want, Hannah?" And I smiled, because for once, he was asking me that. Not telling me. Not ignoring me. Not assuming. Asking. But he didn't like the answer. "I don't want anything," I said, "except to be left alone." He muttered something under his breath, maybe a curse, maybe just frustration. He turned and walked back to the car without another word, and I let him go. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, my mother arrived with a tray of pastries and fake warmth. I didn't let her in. Jason emailed me a list of reasons why I wasn't qualified to manage a property, half of which were laughable. Grant, of course, took the more manipulative route. He sent me a letter pretending to be from an old family friend offering to buy the cabin for a generous amount. The name on the letterhead was fake. The address traced back to a Shell LLC. I forwarded it to my lawyer. They weren't used to losing, especially to me. And while all this was happening, something strange occurred. I began to grow, not just emotionally, but in confidence, in self-worth, in presence. I started journaling again. I started painting, something I hadn't done since high school. I'd sit on the dock at sunset with a cup of tea and just breathe. I reconnected with a few friends I had drifted from, began teaching workshops online about emotional resilience, and slowly carved a life from the quiet that once suffocated me. The more they pushed, the more rooted I became. But the final straw came when they tried to show up together. It was mid-April. The ice on the lake had melted, and the air was beginning to carry the first sense of spring. I had just come back from the farmer's market when I saw their 3 cars parked awkwardly on the grass. My parents, Jason, and Grant, all standing on the porch like some intervention team. I didn't even pretend to be surprised. "We need to talk," my mother said. "No," I said. "You need to listen." They froze. I stepped past them, unlocked the door, and left it open behind me. I didn't care if they followed. But they did. Inside, they looked out of place, like strangers in someone else's home, which by all legal and emotional measures they were. I sat on the couch, legs crossed, calm. "You've made your point," Jason said. "You've punished us enough." I tilted my head. Punishment implies guilt. My father scowled. "You know what we mean." I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply said, "You only remembered I exist when I became useful, when I had something you wanted. Until then, I was invisible." "That's not true," my mother whispered. "It is. And now you're here because you still think I can be negotiated with, that maybe if you offer the right words or look sad enough, I'll cave. But I'm not a child anymore, and I'm not afraid of losing you, because I've already lived my whole life without you." Silence again. And this time, it wasn't mine. It was theirs. That was the first time I saw real discomfort on their faces, not because of anger or frustration, but because the version of me they had created in their minds, the quiet girl, the background presence, the easily dismissed daughter, no longer existed. Jason broke the silence. "So what? You just want to erase us?" "No," I said. "I want you to know what it feels like to be forgotten. That's all." They left eventually, one by one. No yelling, no slamming doors, just quiet exits. It was the first time I had been in the same room with all of them in years. And when the last car pulled away, I didn't cry. I didn't question myself. I didn't even feel triumphant. I just felt whole, and I knew it wasn't over yet. 3 weeks passed after their last visit. The silence that followed was different from the one I had grown used to. It didn't sting. It didn't echo with loneliness. This silence was thick with tension, like the calm before a thunderstorm you know is already on its way. I went on with my life at the cabin, tending to my routines, working remotely, and taking long walks around the lake. But the peace I had fought so hard to build was beginning to feel like something I had to guard, as if the air around me was shifting, unsettled. I got the first message from my cousin Rachel, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. She texted me out of the blue. "Hey stranger, just thinking about you. Want to catch up?" It seemed innocent, but I knew better. Rachel never thought about me. She barely remembered my birthday when we were kids. I didn't reply. Then came a call from one of my old teachers, Mrs. Langford. She left a voicemail, her tone cheerful and probing. I ran into your mother at the store. She mentioned you were doing something wonderful with the family cabin. I'd love to hear about it. Give me a call when you can. I could almost hear my mother's fingerprints on the message. I didn't call back. It became obvious that they were using other people to reach me, trying to find cracks in the walls I'd built. When that didn't work, they changed tactics. One morning, I woke up to find a for sale sign staked on the edge of the property, right near the road where anyone driving by could see it. I stood there, barefoot in the dewy grass, staring at the bold red letters in disbelief. I hadn't put the cabin on the market. I hadn't contacted a realtor. And yet, there it was. A fake listing, complete with a QR code and a contact number. I called the number. It was a burner phone. No one answered. I pulled the sign out of the ground and tossed it behind the shed, but that wasn't the worst of it. 2 days later, I got a letter from the county clerk's office, notifying me that someone had submitted a claim disputing the ownership of the property. They had filed it anonymously, using an online legal service and attaching a scan of a document I had never seen before, an alleged amended will that left the cabin to the Wells family, represented by Richard Wells. The signature was a poor imitation of my grandfather's. The date was wrong, the formatting off. It was a forgery, plain and simple. I drove to the clerk's office in person with my lawyer's copy of the original will. I spent hours going through paperwork, meetings, and legal declarations. Eventually, the claim was dismissed as fraudulent, but the damage was done. My safe space had been invaded, not physically, but emotionally, psychologically. They were trying to gaslight me, to intimidate me, to make me feel like I didn't belong in a place that was legally and spiritually mine. It worked for about 2 days. Then something shifted. I had kept a journal since the first time I visited the cabin as a child. Dozens of entries over the years, some simple, some long and tear-stained, some angry, some joyful. I had written about family trips, about my feelings of being left out, about the first time I kissed a boy, about the summer Jason broke his arm and everyone fussed over him for months while I sat in the corner with a fever no one noticed. The journals were tucked away in a cedar chest in the upstairs bedroom. One rainy afternoon, I pulled them out and started reading. That's when it happened. As I flipped through the worn pages, I came across one entry dated 8 years ago. I had just turned 17. It read, "Grandpa told me something strange today. Said one day the cabin would be mine." I laughed. But he didn't. He said, "You see the soul of this place, Hannah. That's more than anyone else can say." I stared at that page for a long time. I had forgotten he'd said that. Or maybe I hadn't believed it when he did. But reading it again, in my own handwriting, made everything click into place. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a legal loophole. It wasn't a random favor he'd done for me. It was a choice, a recognition, a passing of the torch. He had seen me, even when no one else had, and I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. This was never about the cabin. It was about validation, about being remembered, about being chosen, and that terrified my family. Because once I embraced that truth, I became untouchable. That night, I sat by the fireplace, the journals stacked beside me, and I began writing a letter, not to them, but to myself. A letter that marked the turning point. It read, "You are no longer the shadow. You are no longer the quiet girl waiting to be loved. You are the fire in the hearth, the storm on the lake, the heartbeat of this house. They do not define you. You do." I folded the letter, placed it inside the first journal, and locked the chest. The next morning, I called a friend I hadn't seen in years, Elena. We'd grown apart after college, mostly due to my own isolation. But she had always been kind, grounded, real. We talked for hours, and I told her everything. Every letter, every fake call, every attempt to push me out. She didn't offer pity. She offered clarity. "You don't owe them anything," she said. "You owe you peace." That sentence stayed with me. I made plans. I hired a local photographer and a writer. I commissioned a small documentary-style video. Something beautiful and quiet and honest. It featured me walking along the lake, sitting by the fire, reading excerpts from my journals. I talked about the history of the cabin, my grandfather's love for it, and how the place had saved me in ways no one knew. I didn't mention my family by name, but I didn't have to. Anyone who knew us would understand. Then I posted it online. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't promote it. But the people who needed to see it did. Within 2 days, I received over 100 messages. Friends, neighbors, distant relatives, all writing to tell me how beautiful the story was, how much they admired my strength. A few shared stories of their own, estrangement, inheritance battles, emotional neglect. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. But the most unexpected message came from a man named Eric Langston. He was my grandfather's oldest friend. I remembered him faintly from childhood. A tall man with kind eyes and a voice like gravel. He sent me a message saying he had something that belonged to me. We arranged to meet at a diner near the edge of town. When we sat down, he slid a worn envelope across the table. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this if things ever got difficult," he said. He didn't trust the others to respect his wishes. Inside was a letter, dated 2 months before his death. It read, "Hannah, if you're reading this, I hope it means you stood your ground. I always knew you had more courage than all of them combined. This cabin is yours because you carry the soul of this family, even if they don't recognize it. And if they try to take it from you, don't fight dirty, fight smart. You were never invisible to me." Tears fell silently as I folded the letter back into its envelope. That was the moment everything changed. The battle was no longer about proving my worth, it was about honoring it. I returned from that meeting with Eric feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Steady. Not victorious, not triumphant, just steady. Like I had found the center of myself again. The letter from my grandfather wasn't just a confirmation of what I already knew. It was an anchor. A reminder that I had never been mistaken in how I saw things, how I remembered them, how I had been made to feel. It's strange how one voice believing in you can drown out 1,000 that tried to silence you. I held on to that letter like it was a flame in the dark, and slowly, I began to rebuild. Not just the cabin, not just my routines, but my sense of self. I stopped reacting to them. I stopped anticipating their next move. Instead, I began to fill my days with intention. I woke up early and watched the lake through the mist. I cooked slow breakfasts. I read books I had abandoned years ago and started painting more seriously, sometimes in bursts of color, sometimes in quiet monochrome. I planted flowers near the porch, even though the soil was hard and unyielding at first. It felt good to coax something beautiful out of something that didn't want to give easily. It felt like me. But healing doesn't happen in a straight line. Some days I felt like I was floating, untouchable, powerful. Other days I felt like a child again, shrinking under the weight of memories that still hurt, still haunted. There were nights when I woke up sweating from dreams where I was back at the dinner table at home, trying to speak while everyone talked over me. Or worse, nights where I stood in the cabin only to watch it vanish, brick by brick, while my family stood laughing on the shore. I kept a notebook beside my bed to catch those dreams, to trap them on paper and take away their teeth. Writing them out made them lose their power. I began seeing a therapist virtually, someone Elena had recommended. Her name was Dr. Christine Adler. She was warm but sharp, the kind of person who never flinched when you said something ugly or hard. In one of our sessions, I told her about the fake will, about the sign in the yard, about the silence that now buzzed louder than the chaos. She listened carefully, then said, "You're not just grieving the family you had. You're grieving the one you never got." It hit like a punch to the ribs, because it was true. I hadn't just been angry. I had been mourning the birthdays that never felt joyful, the holidays where I sat in corners while everyone else exchanged memories I was never a part of, mourning the hugs I had to earn, the love I had to chase, the feeling of always being on the outside looking in. Letting go of that grief was messy. I cried a lot during those weeks, sometimes at nothing, sometimes at everything. A bird hitting the window, a song playing in a cafe, a memory of sitting alone in a hospital waiting room the day I got my wisdom teeth pulled, because no one had time to come with me. But growth often blooms in that mess. One afternoon, as I was scrubbing the porch steps and humming absent-mindedly, a car pulled into the drive. I froze for a second, instinctively on edge. But it wasn't them. It was a young woman I didn't recognize. She stepped out and introduced herself as Margot, an estate agent from the area. "I know this might be a strange request," she said, "but would you ever consider opening the cabin as a retreat space? Something small, personal. Your video made the rounds around here. A few of us were moved. There's something sacred about this place." It took me a moment to find my voice. "You watched the video?" She smiled gently. "Twice." I didn't say yes right away. I took time to think, to breathe, to make sure my decision wasn't a reaction, but a choice. The idea lingered in my mind for days. Could I turn the cabin into something more than a sanctuary for myself? Could I open it to others? Let it hold stories besides mine? It felt risky, exposing something that had become so deeply personal, but it also felt right. A natural next step in reclaiming the space, not as a symbol of inheritance, but as a living place of transformation. I partnered with a small group of local women, artists, counselors, and writers. We began to plan weekend retreats for women who had experienced emotional estrangement, family trauma, or simply needed space to hear their own thoughts again. We named it Stillwater, after the lake that wrapped around the property like a silver ribbon. Stillwater became a name that meant healing, quiet power, and renewal. The first retreat brought 5 women. They arrived hesitant, eyes guarded, shoulders tight. But over the weekend, I watched them soften. I watched them laugh on the porch and cry in front of the fireplace. I watched them walk barefoot on the edge of the lake and write poems by candlelight. One night, as I sat beside a woman named Colette who had lost her sister and was navigating the grief of a fractured family, she turned to me and said, "You made this possible, because you didn't give up on yourself." I went to bed that night with a heart so full I thought it might burst. Stillwater became more than I imagined. Not big, not flashy, but deeply human. Word spread gently, not through marketing, but through whispers, through stories, through women who told other women, "You need to go there." My family, of course, noticed. I received a typed letter from my mother. No handwriting, no signature, just a typed note printed on thick paper. It said, "We saw the news about your retreat. We hope you're doing well. Perhaps when things settle, we can visit." I didn't respond. A few weeks later, Grant emailed me a PDF of a news article featuring Stillwater. He highlighted the sentence that mentioned my name and added a comment. "Guess you proved us wrong." I didn't write back. Jason posted something passive-aggressive on Facebook about people who weaponize trauma for attention and then blocked me. It didn't matter anymore, because I wasn't living in reaction to them. I was living in response to myself. In that time, I also began to connect with my grandfather more intentionally. Not literally, but through memory, through ritual. I placed a small photo of him near the fireplace with a brass plate that read, "The one who saw me." Every time I lit the fire, I thanked him for the cabin, for the courage, for the choice. I realized something important in that season. Revenge doesn't always look like fury. Sometimes, revenge is simply refusing to be erased. It's choosing peace so loudly it drowns out the voices that tried to silence you. It's becoming visible on your own terms, and watching those who ignored you struggle to understand your brightness. And just when I thought I had found equilibrium, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail, handwritten this time, not from my mother, not from my brothers, from my father. The envelope was plain, no return address. Inside was a single page, the handwriting unmistakably his. Strong, slanted, impatient. "Hannah, I've watched everything from a distance. The video, the retreat, the people talking. You've become someone I don't recognize. That's not an insult. It's just the truth. You should know, I envy that. I don't know how to say sorry. I don't know if you'd believe me if I did, but I see you now, and I wish I had earlier. Dad." I read it twice, then again. My hands trembled slightly, but not from sadness, from something else. Recognition, vindication, maybe even a touch of peace, but I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because some things don't need words. Some stories are complete without a reply, and mine was finally becoming whole. The letter from my father stayed on the kitchen counter for a full week. I didn't move it. I didn't reread it. I didn't tuck it away in a drawer. I let it sit there, like a guest I wasn't sure I wanted to acknowledge. Some mornings I would glance at it while pouring coffee, and other times I'd completely forget it was there, until I didn't. Until I caught myself wondering whether the man who wrote it had changed, or if he had simply run out of tools to fight me. Whether his words came from reflection or simply exhaustion. I wasn't ready to answer those questions, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to. Stillwater was flourishing. Every weekend brought new women into the cabin, each one with her own history, her own silent ache. I began to see my younger self in them, the way they looked around when they first entered the house, unsure if they were allowed to take up space, the way they hesitated to cry until someone else did first, the way they softened as the days passed, as if the walls themselves whispered, "You are allowed to rest here." I watched transformation happen not through grand epiphanies, but through tiny, almost imperceptible shifts, a shoulder relaxing, a smile lingering a second longer, a woman staying 5 minutes longer after a group session because she didn't want the quiet to end. One woman in particular, her name was Sabrina, arrived one Friday afternoon as a last-minute addition. She had short gray hair, tired eyes, and a guardedness that suggested years of practiced silence. She didn't speak much the first day, not during the group dinner or the late evening journaling exercise, but on the second night, after a long walk by the lake, she lingered by the fire. I was washing mugs in the kitchen when she spoke. "My daughter doesn't talk to me anymore," she said quietly, almost to herself. "She cut me off 2 years ago, said I made her feel small. I didn't understand it then. I do now." I dried my hands and sat across from her. I didn't speak. I just waited. My mother did the same to me, ignored me. I swore I'd be different, but I wasn't. I passed it down like a family heirloom. Her voice cracked. "I don't know how to fix it." I leaned forward. "You begin by not pretending it didn't happen." She nodded slowly. "And if it's too late, then you heal anyway, so that the pain doesn't keep living through you." We sat in silence after that, but something shifted in her expression. And later that weekend, she wrote her daughter a letter, not asking for forgiveness, not begging, but simply telling the truth. That kind of honesty is its own kind of redemption. It was in those moments I realized what the climax of this story really was. Not a courtroom battle, not a dramatic confrontation, but the slow, powerful reclaiming of voice. Mine, and through me, others. Revenge didn't look like screaming. It looked like planting something and watching it grow while the people who doubted you had to watch from the sidelines. But the universe has a way of testing how deep your roots really go. It was early September when I received the phone call. My brother Jason had been in an accident, a motorcycle crash. He had broken both legs, a collarbone, and had a severe concussion. He would survive, but he'd be in recovery for months. My mother called me from the hospital. Her voice cracked like it hadn't in years. "He asked for you," she said. "He keeps asking if you're coming." I didn't respond. I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after that call, staring at the floor, trying to reconcile the conflicting storm inside me. This was the brother who had humiliated me at family dinners, mocked me in front of friends, who once told me I was too soft to survive in the real world. And now he was broken in a hospital bed, asking for me. I drove for nearly an hour without knowing where I was going. I ended up on a quiet back road that cut through a field of golden grass. I parked the car and sat there, engine off, windows down, listening to the wind. And then I wept. Not for Jason, but for myself. For the part of me that still wanted to be wanted. For the girl who would have jumped at the chance to be needed, even by someone who had never truly seen her. That part of me had grown quieter, but she still lived somewhere inside. And in that moment, I held her in silence. I told her she didn't have to go. She didn't owe them that. I never visited the hospital. Instead, I wrote Jason a letter. It said, "You're in pain, and I'm sorry for that. No one deserves to suffer. I hope you heal in every way possible, physically and otherwise. But I can't come, not because I don't care, but because I care too much. And being near you would hurt more than it would help. Take this time to reflect. That's the only thing I ever wanted for you. I don't know if he read it. I don't know if it mattered. But I mailed it anyway. Not for him. For me. In the following weeks, the energy around the cabin shifted again. Not heavier, just clearer. Like the air after a storm when everything feels rinsed clean. I began to see myself differently. Not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a woman who had chosen her own name after being called so many others. I had once been their disappointment, their scapegoat, their afterthought. Now, I was simply Hannah, and that was enough. Stillwater continued to thrive. We added a second retreat focused on creativity and personal storytelling. I began leading sessions myself, guiding women through the art of memory and self-expression. It was both healing and exhausting, but in the best way. I ended each weekend feeling like I had poured something meaningful into the world, and in return, something inside me kept filling back up. That autumn, the leaves turned gold and crimson around the cabin. I took a photo of the lake at sunrise and printed it on a canvas to hang above the fireplace. It reminded me of how far I'd come, from invisibility to presence, from silence to impact. And then, one evening, I received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small wooden box. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my grandfather, a keepsake box he kept on his dresser, filled with odds and ends, a broken compass, a faded key, a piece of driftwood from the lake. On top of everything sat a folded note. She was always the quiet one. That's why she was always listening. That's why she understood what mattered. I didn't leave her the cabin to punish anyone else. I left it to her because I trusted her to do something meaningful with it. I didn't recognize the handwriting. Maybe it was from one of his friends. Maybe someone he had confided in. It didn't matter. What mattered was the truth behind the words. I had taken something given to me not in pity, but in faith, and I had built something real with it. That night, I lit the fireplace, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat alone with the letter and the box in my lap. I felt the full weight of the journey, the ache and the grace of it, pressing gently into my chest. And I whispered to the silence around me, not expecting an answer but offering something that felt like a prayer. I'm not invisible anymore. The snow began to fall earlier than expected that year. By mid-November, the lake was already starting to freeze over at the edges, thin plates of ice clinging to the shoreline like delicate glass. I stood by the window that morning with a mug of coffee in my hands, watching a bird hop along the frozen dock. Everything was still. And in that stillness I felt it again, that quiet knowing that I had done something few people ever truly get to do. I had taken my pain, my silence, my erasure, and I had turned it into something that gave other people space to breathe. Stillwater went into its winter rhythm. The retreats became smaller, more intimate. Sometimes only 3 or 4 women would stay at a time, and those weekends felt especially sacred. We'd gather around the fire in wool socks, sip mulled cider, and share stories late into the night. In those spaces, I learned that the world was full of invisible women, smart, strong, capable people who had been pushed aside in their own homes, dismissed at their own tables. They didn't come here looking for answers. They came hoping to remember who they were before the world taught them to apologize for existing, and the cabin, somehow, always knew how to hold them. One weekend, near the close of December, a woman named Meredith arrived from Minneapolis. She was in her 60s, wore a green knit hat that matched her eyes, and had a laugh that filled the whole room. But beneath that brightness was a grief so deep I could feel it pulsing through her words. Her husband had passed the year before, and with him, she said, had gone all sense of identity. We were married for 38 years, she told me on the second night, and I realized I don't know who I am without him. Not really. She sat across from me in the common room, the fire crackling behind her. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Then maybe that's what you're here to find out, I said. Her eyes brimmed with tears. Do you think it's too late to start over? No, I said softly. I think sometimes it's the only thing left to do. The next morning I found her standing by the lake in the snow, arms crossed against the cold, but a smile playing at her lips. I think I'm ready, she said, to be someone again. Moments like that stitched the last pieces of myself back together. I wasn't just healing, I had become a conduit for healing, not in some grand savior way, but in the quiet, real way that matters, by creating a place where people could fall apart and still feel safe. It had been over a year since I had inherited the cabin, and my family had gone mostly quiet. My mother still sent the occasional holiday card. Jason texted a few times with one-word messages. Congrats. Saw the article. Nice job. I never replied. Grant didn't reach out at all, and that was for the best. My father, after his letter, hadn't sent another word, but I didn't wonder anymore. I didn't reread the letter or hope for a sequel. Some things are best left where they landed. One day, while going through a drawer in the hallway, I found a shoebox I hadn't noticed before. Inside were a dozen old Polaroids from when I was a child, not the usual family photos. These were different. Most of them were taken at the cabin. Me, age 7, holding a fishing pole next to my grandfather. Me, reading on the porch swing with a blanket tucked under my chin. One photo showed me painting a small wooden birdhouse while my grandfather knelt beside me, handing me the paintbrush. I didn't even remember that moment until I saw the picture. But suddenly, it rushed back with startling clarity. The sound of the wind, the smell of the pine, the way he had said, "Make it yours, Hannah." And I had. All of it. The photo went into a frame by my bed. Winter deepened. The snow came heavy and fast. The lake disappeared under a frozen sheet, and the cabin grew quieter between retreats. I started a new journal, my first fresh one since the beginning of the journey. On the first page, I wrote, "You have survived the fire. Now plant something in the ashes." I began to write every morning by the window before the sun rose. Pages filled quickly. Not just memories or reflections, but ideas, visions, hopes. I wrote about expanding Stillwater into a seasonal residency for women who wanted to create, paint, write, compose. I wrote about hosting grief circles in the spring, story workshops in the fall. I wrote about offering scholarships for women who couldn't afford to come, but needed it more than anyone. And I wrote about myself, too, not in relation to who I had been in my family, but who I was becoming on my own. One evening, near the end of February, a letter arrived addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. It was from my Aunt Susan, my mother's sister. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. The letter was short. "Dear Hannah, I wanted to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. Your grandfather told me years ago that he was leaving the cabin to you. He said you were the only one who ever saw it. Not just looked at it, but really saw it. He told me, Hannah knows how to love what others ignore. I think that was his way of saying he saw you. I hope you know that. Susan." I read the letter 3 times. I folded it gently and placed it in the same cedar chest where I kept my journals. Not because I needed the validation, but because it felt like a missing puzzle piece that fit snugly into place. The truth had always been there, beneath the noise, beneath the hierarchy of who mattered and who didn't. I had loved quietly, and he had seen it. And sometimes, that's enough. The thaw came slowly that year. By late March, the lake began to shimmer again, tiny waves flickering across the surface. I sat on the edge of the dock one morning, feet dangling, wrapped in a blanket, coffee in hand. I thought about what my grandfather might say if he were beside me. Maybe he wouldn't say anything at all. Maybe he'd just nod, that soft smile in his eyes, the one that meant he was proud without having to prove it. And then I thought about my family, not with bitterness, not with fire, but with distance, with clarity. I thought about how long I had fought to be seen by them, only to realize they were never capable of seeing beyond their own reflections. I had stopped knocking on a door that was never meant to open, and instead, I had built my own home, my own way. That was the revenge, in the end. Not the silence, not the inheritance, not even the letter. The revenge was joy. It was peace. It was the kind of life that bloomed in spite of everything that had tried to crush it. It was waking up every morning and not flinching. It was sitting on that dock, whole and unafraid, with no one left to impress and nothing left to prove. I looked out across the lake, the water catching the first light of spring, and I whispered aloud, not to anyone, not for anyone, just for me. I made it. Spring arrived slowly, like a shy visitor unsure whether she was welcome. Buds began to form along the maple trees that lined the edge of the lake, and the ground softened underfoot, no longer frozen and resistant, but pliable, ready. I walked the path behind the cabin one morning, a basket tucked into the crook of my elbow, gathering early wildflowers that had sprouted between patches of last year's dead leaves. The world was waking up, and so was I. It had been over 18 months since I took ownership of the cabin. 18 months since the will was read, since the silence broke open into something sharper, something truer. 18 months since I stopped begging to be understood and started choosing to be whole. Time has a way of smoothing out even the jagged edges of memory, not erasing them, just softening them, so that when they return, they don't pierce as deeply. I still remembered the way my father clenched his jaw when the cabin was given to me, the sound of my mother's voice trying to remain calm, composed, Jason's disbelief, Grant's manipulation. But those memories no longer sat at the center of my mind. They had drifted to the corners, making space for new ones. Stillwater had grown in ways I couldn't have imagined. We now had a small staff, a therapist, a chef who used to run a bakery downtown, and 2 part-time coordinators who handled logistics and registration. I had resisted the idea of help for a while, unsure if sharing the work meant sharing the soul of what I had created. But as each person stepped in, it became clear that they weren't taking anything from me. They were simply adding to it. The retreat weekends ran smoother, the guests had more personalized care, and I was free to focus on what mattered most to me, the stories. We started a new tradition that spring. Every Sunday evening, after the final session of each retreat, we would gather outside around a fire pit overlooking the lake. There, each woman would be invited to share something, a memory, a revelation, a commitment. There were no rules. Some shared through tears, some through laughter, some in quiet, halting sentences that carried more weight than anything I'd heard in years. And at the end, they'd write a single sentence on a stone and place it in the garden beside the cabin. By midsummer, the garden was filled with stones. I am not broken. My voice matters. She never saw me, but I see myself now. I survived. That's enough. I visited the garden almost every morning. Some days I would kneel down and run my fingers over the words. Other days I would simply sit on the bench nearby and watch as birds hopped between the plants, oblivious to the weight of what lived in the soil beneath them. Life was like that. Layered, beautiful, sometimes unbearably heavy, and still blooming. I hadn't spoken to my family in months, not since my father's letter. The silence now felt less like exile and more like peace. Occasionally, curiosity would creep in, where they were, what they were doing, whether they ever spoke of me. But I never reached out, and they didn't either. Some bridges aren't meant to be crossed again, they're meant to stay broken, as a reminder of what once burned and why you'll never return. In late July, I received a phone call from Eric Langston, my grandfather's old friend. "I've been thinking," he said, "about your grandfather, about the cabin, about what it all means now." I sat on the back steps, the sun setting across the lake, painting everything in soft pink and gold. "What are you thinking about?" He used to say legacy isn't about bloodlines. It's about impact, about what you leave behind in people, not just in property. He paused. "You've done something remarkable, Hannah. You took a piece of grief and turned it into a lighthouse." I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My throat was too full. He cleared his throat. "There's a scholarship I'd like to start. For women who can't afford the retreat. I'd like to fund it. In his name. If that's all right with you." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "That's more than all right. That's perfect." We named it the Wells Light, because lighthouses guide you home, even through storms, even when you've forgotten which way is forward. By autumn, I had compiled journal entries, letters, and stories from the women who had passed through Stillwater. With their permission, I began shaping them into a book. Not a memoir, not quite. More like a tapestry, woven from the threads of voices that had once been small, but now rang with strength. The working title was The Ones Who Stayed Quiet. I wasn't sure if it would ever be published. That wasn't the point. The point was capturing it before it drifted away, making sure it had a place to live outside the cabin walls. One afternoon in October, I took a walk deep into the woods behind the lake. The trees had turned, fiery orange and rich burgundy. My boots crunched through the fallen leaves. I walked until I reached the clearing where my grandfather once took me camping. The fire ring was still there, though overgrown with moss. I sat down on a fallen log and closed my eyes. "I hope I made you proud," I whispered. A breeze moved through the trees, stirring the leaves, brushing against my face like a hand. I opened my eyes, smiled, and whispered back, "I think I did." Time didn't stop. It kept moving forward, as it always does, but I no longer felt like I was running to catch up or frozen in place. I had joined its rhythm. I had stepped into my own current. By the first snowfall, I hosted a winter solstice retreat. Only 5 women attended, but it was perhaps the most powerful gathering yet. We lit candles, wrapped ourselves in wool blankets, and told stories of things we had released and things we had reclaimed. And when we walked outside under the stars, the sky stretched endlessly above us, black and velvet, the kind of sky that makes you feel both small and infinite at once. That night, as I sat by the fire after everyone had gone to bed, I opened my last journal and wrote, "This is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the rest of it. The part where I don't shrink, the part where I stop asking for permission, the part where the silence becomes music, the part where I am enough." I closed the journal, pressed my hand to the cover, and let the warmth of the fire soak into my skin. The next morning, I placed a new stone in the garden. It didn't have a quote or a declaration. It just had one word: home. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family until you finally stood up and changed everything? Share your story in the comments. If this journey touched your heart, please like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories of growth, healing, and self-worth. Send this to someone who needs to remember their voice matters. And never forget, sometimes the greatest revenge is becoming the person they said you could never be. Thank you for listening to my story. You deserve peace, respect, and a life that belongs entirely to you.